So when I first saw this thing being marketed, I honestly didn't really give it a second look, but after spending some time with it, I was actually shocked by what it could do and how much I really liked it. Now the question is, does it have what it takes to be your go-to retro handheld, or is it just another forgettable gadget? Now let's go ahead and find out. But before we take a look, I do want to thank the team over at AliExpress for sending over the TrimUI Brick to the channel for me to share with you guys. Now, first thing in the box is the actual console itself, and it is substantially smaller than I had anticipated, but we're gonna set this aside for just a moment. Then you've got an instruction manual, a USB Type-C charging cable, as well as a couple interesting things that they threw in here. These are actual caps that go on the L2, R2, L, and R buttons, so that way you can change the height or the profile of those buttons depending on your preference, which is interesting. We'll look at these as well in a few minutes. Now here is the console itself. I've got to be honest, when I first saw this thing being marketed and they called it the Brick, I assumed it was a much larger device. I assumed it was going to be like a big DMG style device, and honestly I wasn't really interested in that because it'd be big and bulky. I gotta say, this thing's actually really small. This is kind of like the Miu Mini scale. Honestly, I was kind of surprised. This thing is built differently. It is heavy. It's got a good weight to it. It actually feels super comfortable in your hands. It's got a nice screen size, and overall it is small and pocket friendly with a super minimalist design. Now in terms of the actual build quality, it does have like an ABS plastic style body, so you can see everything that's white here. All of this is going to be your plastic, but this section right here that kind of is shiny, that's actually a metal plate on the back, and it does make it feel super premium. The device in general, as I'm holding it, it feels very substantial. It feels weighty. It's nice in your hands. But then we have the buttons on the back, which is kind of an interesting thing because as they are, they're not the most comfortable to use. You can feel your hands are getting a little bit cramped, but to be fair, with most really small devices like this, the L and R2 buttons are always really hard to get right. So I think the idea of them including these interchangeable caps on these buttons, and they're super easy. They just kind of pop off and then you can put new ones on depending on your preference. Some are a little higher, some are more shallow. Some have this little difference in height. You can see that little difference there. And then other ones are just going to be completely straight all the way across if you prefer that. So they do give you some options to make it more comfortable, which is a nice little feature that they've included there. Now jumping over to the front of the device, the D-pad and the front face buttons all feel good. They've got really good responsiveness. They've got a nice little tactile feel to them. They feel comfortable. Their size is good. Everything about them actually feels pretty decent. They've also got a few extra buttons along the bottom. Over here, we've got our menu button, we've got a select button, and we've got our start button right over here. And then directly below the screen, we actually have two additional buttons. Now, those are actually function buttons, and you can use those for a variety of different functions in the settings. I'm going to go over some of that a little bit later. Looking on the right hand side of the device, we have our power button, and then we've actually got our function toggle. That's going to turn our functions on and off. Along the top, we actually have this LED light bar, which I will show you guys lit up as well. And then on the other side, we just have our volume rocker, our up and down. Along the bottom, we have space for one single micro SD card. We've got a USB Type-C charging port. We have this tiny little reset button, and then we also have a 3.5mm headphone jack. Not much going on along the back, but we do have an additional USB Type-C port. Now this can be used for any sort of OTG or accessories that you want to plug into it. Now jumping into the technical specs, we are running the Allwinner A133P CPU. That's going to be clocked in at 1.8 gigahertz, and that's coupled with the PowerVR GE8300, which is clocked in at 660 megahertz. That is going to come with 1 gig of LPDDR4X RAM, and then it's got 4 gigs of internal storage, but you can of course add a micro SD card up to 256 gigabytes for additional storage. The The battery is a 3000 milliamp hour battery, which should give you about 5 to 6 hours of gameplay. And then jumping over to the screen, we've got a beautiful 3.2 inch IPS display with a resolution of 1024 by 768, which is going to give you your nice 4:3 aspect ratio for retro gaming. Now, in terms of the software and the UI, it actually has a custom built Linux system. Now, if you're familiar with TrimUI, they actually had a very similar UI that they used on their TrimUI Smart Pro handheld. And that handheld was actually a really nice handheld. So they kind of have just reused that user interface, and it's really easy to navigate. It's super simple to just kind of find what you want and play. Now, in terms of the actual navigation, you've got your favorite section, you've got a recent section that'll go over any of the games that you've most recently played. Then it's got your bests. This is kind of like a collection section. So in here, you've got a Bomberman collection, you've got a Famicom multi-cartridge collection, you've got your Nostalgia Minigames collection. Those are all going to come preloaded with the device. And then you've got a bunch of other games that'll come included depending on the storage size that you pick. Then, of course, we've got our games section. This is going to be where we're going to find all of our individual console emulators and the dedicated games for those. In the storage package that I've got games that kind of range anywhere from your arcade games to Dreamcast to Game Gear. We've got PSP on here, Nintendo, Super Nintendo, N64. The next section is going to be our port section, and I actually found this to be pretty cool. There's a bunch of really awesome games on here. You've got access to Celeste, which is an incredible platformer. If you haven't played it, you'll want to. We also have Sonic Mania, we've got Stardew Valley, we've got Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge. Lots of really good games to try in the port section, and they all run really, really well on the device, as you guys can see on screen here. We have our apps section. So this is going to be everything from things like Moonlight or e-readers or RetroArch or anything like that. But in here, we've also got that function key setting. So as I mentioned on the side, we have this function toggle, and then we have two function keys right up here below the screen. If we go ahead and enter into that setting, we've actually got the ability to assign one of these different functions directly to that F1 key. So for example, if we want to turn on and off the LED lights that you guys can see here along the back, we've got LEDs that kind of go in below your shoulder buttons. We've got this LED bar on the top. We've got the LED glow from these two buttons here. If you actually want to assign that to your F1, we can go ahead and do that. And by doing that and then backing out, it saves that feature. Then we just have to press this button, and now all of our LEDs just turn off immediately. Now, jumping back into that section, if we press the select key, we can actually change to the second function option. And for that, you can choose between a D-pad or joystick toggle, which is actually a good handy feature if you're going to be playing something like N64 on this thing. But then there's also a CPU clock switch. They've got the LCD brightness controller as well. You can control that from your function key. So lots of different things can be controlled right with these little buttons. That can be easier than fussing around with the actual settings options. Next, we have a NetPlay section, and then finally we have our basic device settings. This is going to give you control over everything from the display brightness to the volume to connecting to Wi-Fi or connecting Bluetooth devices. You can also do things like change up the themes a little bit. They've got a few pre-installed color themes. Nothing crazy, but you do have lots of flexibility, including even things like mapping out your keys slightly differently if you prefer to do that. Now we're going to jump into some gameplay and performance, which is probably what you guys are most interested in. We're going to look at some of the more retro consoles just so you can see how they look on the screen, but things like NES, Super Nintendo, Game Boy Advance, those things are going to be flawless. They're not going to have any issues with frame rate. Everything's just going to look really good. Next, we're going to jump into some PlayStation 1 emulation because we want to look at some of the 3D rendering that it can handle, and honestly, it doesn't have any issues whatsoever. PS1 runs really well on this device as well. Now we're going to jump into some of the more advanced emulators. So we're going to start with a little bit of N64. I've said this a dozen times on this channel, and I'm not really a big fan of playing N64 on any sort of handheld that doesn't have a dedicated analog stick. But we are going to do some gameplay just so you guys can see how well it does perform on something like an N64 emulator. Next, we're going to look at some Dreamcast games, and surprisingly, Dreamcast actually runs fairly well as well. It is going to be running through the Flycast emulator on RetroArch. And then finally, we're going to take a look at PSP, which really is the limit of where this device can go in terms of performance. You are going to run into some frame rate drops, and you do likely need to have auto skip on for many of the titles with a base resolution of 1x, but you can get some enjoyable gameplay out of this thing on PSP. Now, the speaker quality on this thing is actually really good. Gameplay feels great, and the controls and the overall design, they did a fantastic job. So this is actually a really good product. put out by TrimUI if you're into those more compact handhelds. If you're not into the really small handhelds, this is probably not the right product for you. And you can probably take a look at some of their other devices. The TrimUI Smart Pro is a good option. There's a ton of other products available that are slightly bigger if that's what you're interested in. Now, taking a look at some of the pros and cons of the TrimUI Brick. On the pro side, it is ultra portable. It is really small. It is very easy to take with you anywhere you want to go, and you can stick it in your pocket. It also has a great screen and super solid performance across most of your 8, 16-bit, even 32-bit games. It does a good job there. The next point is that it has an easy-to-use Linux-based operating system, and it does have some custom firmware options available in the community. And then finally, it is actually really reasonably priced. This thing can range anywhere from like $60 to $80, depending on what additional storage package you want to pick up with it. Then on the con side of things, there is no analog sticks. Like I mentioned, playing things like N64 are less ideal. There's a bunch of games that end up getting excluded from this list, like Ape Escape for PS1, just because you don't have those analog sticks. Another con, although I said it's ultra portable, its small size can be a con. It may be a little bit more uncomfortable to play for longer gaming sessions, your hands might get cramped, things of that nature. This is a great pick up and play console if you're going to be doing short burst gaming. And then finally, one last con is going to be that it does have a very basic UI. It's very easy to navigate, but it's very simple and it's not highly customizable. Now, who is this for? This is going to be perfect for a casual retro gamer who wants something sleek and pocketable, but it's definitely not for analog heavy games or for longer gaming sessions. Now, I'm gonna leave some links in the description down below for you guys to learn a little bit more or to pick one up for yourself. So I do want to thank the team over at AliExpress for sending me this review unit. I do appreciate it very much. That's all I've got for you guys. Thank you so very much for watching, and I'll speak to you guys again real soon.